My conversation today is with longtime author, practitioner, and chief of the Magical Order of the Aurora, Nick Farrell. With several decades of experience in lineages such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the Servants of the Light, and a fascinating side order created by the adepts of Farrell, the last original Golden Dawn temple, the Order of the Table Round, Nick is a veritable piece of occult history himself. In 2007, Nick established the Magical Order of the Aurora, within which he has been working and teaching to the present day. His works, Helios Unbound and Beyond the Sun, were big influences on my own researches into magic, and we began this discussion talking about the connection between Robert Falcon, an adept of the original class of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, who set up the temple Smaragdim Thalasis in New Zealand, which would come to be known as Farrell, whose adepts Nick would learn from at an early age, and Falcon's connection to the founder of anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanum Podcast.
Is the connection to Steiner, and I think I remember reading in Beyond the Sun that he had something to do with like continental Rosicrucian masonry or something. So that's a very, very interesting kind of point.
What happened was Falcon was looking for a connection to the Rosicrucian movement. He wanted to get the higher grades because his contacts had warned him he had to get away from Mathers as much as he could. And so he sent his number two, who was Neville Meakin, to Europe to find these continental Rosicrucians who could give him these higher grades, which would give him something over and above what Mathers had. And Meakin, through various means, ended up meeting Steiner. And Steiner at the time wasn't really the person that he became later. He was very much into continental masonry. He was heavily influenced by some of the movements that were going on around some quite interesting Rosicrucian types. Later on, he went on and became the thing that I can never pronounce, and gained a lot of followers from that, and renounced Rosicrucianism completely and utterly.
Wow.
Now, when Meakin arranged for Falcon to meet Steiner, I don't think was particularly impressed, because when Steiner met Waite, Steiner wasn't really sure who Falcon was. Anyway, they got the grades through Milken mostly, and they were given what Steiner called the link. And this is really important, because the link is what differentiates later Golden Dawn stuff in New Zealand from what happened in England. And the link gave you the right to initiate to at least 7-4. Wow. and also set your own orders up. And so this was applied to the Stella Matutina. It was also applied in New Zealand. So once somebody got to 7-4, they were given this little ritual called the link, and that connected them to everything that had gone before in the Rosicrucian movement. And it was not many people knew it existed. In fact, it was given to Westcott, but he got it, I think, at 6-5, because Falcon was trying to impress him at the time. But anyway, that became part of the tradition. So it became clear that you couldn't really start your own order, start your own groups, or anything until you're a 7-4 with a link. And that gave you the connection to the Rosicrucian movement. And it also ensured that the order continued, because the link provided an ever abundant supply of new teaching. The whole point of it was that you were supposed to get the link and go off and do your own thing, whatever within the Rosicrucian framework. And that's exactly what Falcon did with it.
Just to tack on to that, I'm wondering if you know why particularly Steiner ended up renouncing Rosicrucianism.
I have no idea. I imagine it could have been political. It could have just simply been that his followers wanted him to do it. This is one of the problems when you get quite well known and public, is you have to dumb down what you've got. And I don't really regard Steinerism as particularly cutting edge occultism. It's a lot of words, but it doesn't really go much. And I think what he wanted a big following, and to get a big following, he had to get rid of because Rosicrucianism was never going to be big, and it was possible. I don't really know, but it was quite possibly male orientated at that time. So he wanted to get a bigger, more international general audience, and that's what he got with the Steiner movement.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The first thing that struck me, and it's happened to me just a few times on this podcast before, where I have a guest that has contributed so widely and has been proficient and an authority in several different areas of occultism, magic, history, practice, all this stuff, where it's like, where do you even begin with a question to start the conversation off? But I know that you've been a staple of the community long before an explosion of interest, the likes of which we're kind of experiencing right now. And certainly you're a voice that I encountered very early on in my magical trajectory. I'm wondering how you've seen things change in these and adjacent communities over the years. I mean, is there something that in particular that you can speak to, the differences between then and now?
Oh yeah, it's completely different. I think I feel like an old fart, and that's the real weird thing about it, is that when I came on the scene, it was in the 1980s, and I was 17 or 18. And okay, I had a religious background, but I was enthusiastic, read everything. I joined several groups over the next 10 years, and I was very enthusiastic, archetypal student type, all those sorts of things. And there was a feeling that you were just lucky just to be there. And I felt lucky to be there. I went to England from New Zealand, and I was suddenly hanging out with all these people who written all these books I'd read, and I just felt lucky. And that has disappeared. The internet has basically acted as a tearer down of that particular approach, and it makes anyone who has got a loud mouth or a keyboard the ability to basically put their view across, even though it has no background, no substance at all, and run down some of these names. So book quality has dropped dramatically because of this, because people who are writers just don't want to put the stuff out there, because it means they have to deal with some kid in his basement running them down. And I can understand that. If you put yourself out there, you're going to get yourself into trouble. And whereas being in trouble used to be you got an angry snotogram in the mail, now you get 2 or 3 weeks of being slammed on Facebook. And it can I can understand that it can be really, really depressing. And a lot of the good teachers, and some of them are still around, but they just don't go near the net. They don't do anything public. They don't write anymore. They just sit down with their groups and stay quiet. And I think that is something that's something that's missing. But then again, that's like I'm now in my late 50s, so I am now officially an old fart. And that is probably what people who are training me, how people were training me in the 80s saw me. So it might be the same thing. It's just a different generation looking at it. But it does feel different. And it does feel like the energy isn't quite as focused as it was. And that's weird because we didn't have access to half a ton of the material we have now. I mean, we didn't have all the Key of Solomon stuff, all the Picatrix hadn't been translated out of Latin. So all the stuff that we use now wasn't there. And that was a big problem. So we had to rely on, Kabbalah was, or Dion Fortune. Dion Fortune was a big name, and particularly in Britain. And then you had people like Paul Foster Case and BOTA running his tarot system. And, that was not as significant as what you can pick up now.
Yeah, that's an interesting assessment. My initial forays into magic and the occult came at sort of this intersection time. When I first started researching these things, there was nothing available on the internet. Maybe Occult of Personality, Greg Kaminsky's podcast, but there really wasn't as much information. One of the things that I'm seeing now is that academia has taken a very, and I've talked about this several times with different guests, that they're taking an active sort of, they're paying more attention and taking it a little bit more seriously, at least in translation stuff, and providing us with these source materials. And what I'm finding is that, we're kind of suffering from an overabundance of information in a lot of ways, because what that can sometimes do is, in certain sectors, I've seen it sort of pare back the practical application, right? So I can read about this all day and theorize about it, and maybe try a ritual, once a month, once every month. But really, I find that a lot of the earlier literature that I was consuming, that sort of Llewellyn Golden Age, so to speak, a lot of it had a strong practical emphasis. And that's really, I think, what I was looking for in magic, was the practicality. And it's only now, in retrospect, that I feel myself having to, take this more scholarly tack just to kind of keep up with the community dialogue. But to your point, there is certainly value in pulling back.
Well, I think one of the things about academic stuff, and this is what I agree exactly with that. The academic stuff has been actually really valuable, because particularly in the 80s and 90s, there's a great mythology built up around magic, particularly in England. And we were given all sorts of funny stories that we were half expected to believe, Atlantean stuff and all these sorts of, but it sounds really daft, but it actually was legitimately accepted. And there was no objective thinking about it. There was no historical stuff that you could actually pull up that would disagree with it. So why not accept it? And paganism, for example, had strong nature worship roots. If you talked about paganism as an ancient would have understood it, you would have, they would have, modern pagans would have laughed at you. No, it's all, trees and rivers and things like that. Whereas paganism was often an urban thing. And when you look at these things and you look at the interaction between paganism and, say, angels, which are two competing systems, you discover that the ancients didn't see them as competing systems. They just put them together. So you'd have an altar that would be would contain Zeus and that, but Michael would also be worshipped. So it was it wasn't as cut and dried. And academia has been very good at producing this material for us, because it means that we can have a lot more eclectic approach to magic than was possible in 20 years ago, where it was specifically told us we weren't supposed to mix traditions. They were. I remember it being shouted at me a number of times that it was a very bad idea to mix different god forms from different religions, different angels, different. Kabbalah was okay; you could get away with it because Kabbalistic angels, for some reason, played nice with everybody. But you certainly couldn't muck around with something like I'm trying to think, Babylonian stuff and Egyptian stuff. It just wasn't done. And academically now they've said no, it's probably all right. Everybody was doing it then, so why not now?
Yeah. Well, also to that point, to kind of piggyback off of that, I have noticed now, right? So just because I see it on the internet doesn't mean that is, the objectifiable, the objective truth of actually what's happening. But from my observations of the community dialogue, I do find this this bifurcation that still persists, and typically, and it may be a product of my ignorance, my perception of that, but typically, very recently, I've seen practitioners of specifically goetic magic sort of not wanting to get involved with the theurgic stuff. And I think some of that has to do with this recent kind of flood of Neoplatonic sort of the intellectual stuff, the philosophical stuff. But what are your thoughts on that? Have you seen that as well, or how do you navigate that kind of practice? Because I know you're interested in more Solomonic stuff as well as theurgy.
Yeah, I basically use all of them. I wouldn't see why you would. I mean, one of the things that I did with my approach to Goetia was it didn't last very long, because soon after I started researching Goetia, I became interested in theurgic stuff, and you can get into the underworld just as easily using that as you can summoning a demon. I mean, one of the things that I've recently just put out a book by Pat Seletsky through Talismans and Evocations, and he found a very interesting paper, where it shows how the Golden Dawn was using a goetic system. Now, most people say that the Golden Dawn is all fluffy and light, and particularly the goetics talk about, they call Masonic traditions, as a bit of a slight, and say, oh no, they couldn't possibly be doing it. But they were, and they were doing it because at a certain point, you do have to get into that underworld shadow side. And it's not just, summoning demons to get someone to bed with you. It's there to activate a part of a shadow side of a planet or a shadow side of self. And I think that they all have a use. And I think that that use is often ignored.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. I like the way you sort of bringing light to that aspect of the Golden Dawn, because I from what I understand,
darkness.
Well, yeah, I mean, right. From what I understand, it's still in some orders that phase of the working. But I remember, for me, probably the book that I looked to immediately after I had started really reading and studying some of the Golden Dawn flying roles, which are really, in a lot of respects, vehemently pointing towards theurgy as this sort of spiritual operation par excellence for the inner order. I found Helios Unbound, which you put together. It opened up a whole new world of influence for me, because I think one of the first things that you do in that book is tell people, okay, go read Chris Brennan's Hellenistic astrology book. And that, I'm ethnically Greek, so I gravitate more towards those kind of god forms and that history. But I'm wondering how, knowing that you did go through the inner order grades of the Hermetic Order, the Golden Dawn. I'm wondering how that Hellenistic approach sort of either evolved out of or dovetailed with your work in the Golden Dawn inner grades.
Ironically enough, it came out of living where I am, which is in Rome. I felt closer to the Roman gods, and of course through the Roman gods, which are indirectly Greek, or they had Greek masks, the Greek with Roman masks often. I find that the approach, if you look at Helios Unbound, there is a lot of Golden Dawn influence on it, because what I wanted to do with that was look at how you could take a technique, which the Golden Dawn was a series of different techniques, but then place Greek or Roman theurgic connections to them to get a similar result. So even the lesser pentagram ritual, which is a mainstay of every Golden Dawn group, you can change the pronunciation of that. Just change it a fraction so it's more like the Greeks would have pronounced these names, and it becomes something different. It becomes something unique. It becomes something yours, and it becomes something that is part of a different flavored tradition. And that inspired me more and more to develop more and more of those exercises. And I had different experiences with different rituals, and different god forms had nicer feelings, and those feelings I felt comfortable with. And as it turned out, it worked towards a particular goal. When you start looking at PGM, which is the Greek magical papyri, you start seeing these gods being used in magical ways. Now, originally, my first significant teacher said PGM was black magic, and I should avoid it. But when I went back and studied it, I could actually start to see, if you start seeing these forms as living creatures that you're working with, they take on a different meaning. Okay, it's not high Kabbalah, and I don't think it needs to be. But because if you take, say, Zeus, he's in the Golden Dawn system, you would say he was astral because he's got a form. So a form, once something's got a form, it has to be astral. So, but Zeus also hasn't got a form. There's a point where you can discover Zeus at a deeper level where he has no form. And that is where the theurgy comes in. But to do that, to have any relationship at all with this indivisible Zeus, you have to have gone through the astral Zeus to understand it. And that's one of the reasons, and it takes a long time. One of the things I tried to get with Helios was to get this idea that the more you did a repetitive act, the more you would start to develop the astral force around you, and this would later then enable this higher spiritual force to animate it. So when you do a regular working, any regular working, it creates an astral impact. And that astral impact becomes like a car. And when you've got your car, you can then, or an Uber. An Uber's probably better, because once you've got your car, you can then call an Uber driver to drive it for you. And it's his car, but it's still a force that you've created for him. And I think when I was looking at, with Helios, I wanted to figure out what could you actually use the system for? How could you use it for? And one of the arguments or fun debates I have with Aaron Leach is that, well, why not use it for something like the Abramelin system? Why don't you replace the Abramelin system, which is basically spending half an hour praying to something for 6 months and then having a big shindig at the end of it? Why don't you replace it with something a bit more pagan-y, coherent, and pressurized, over a longer period of time and see if it makes a difference, and see if that gets you your higher genius, which is, of course, different from your holy guardian angel, although me and Aaron will fight to the bitter death to say they're two different things. I think the higher genius is completely different, but
I love that you said that.
I think the higher genius is something a bit higher, and he thinks the holy guardian angel is another version of it, which is fair enough. I can see the logic. But if you had gone through the Orthodox Church, I lived in Bulgaria for a while, and I was involved briefly with the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. And at your baptism, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church is fascinating because it has never been reformed since the 11th century.
Wow.
So it's got all the old traditions in there. It's like, and most of the time they don't even know what they're doing. So it's very similar to Greek Orthodox, but there are some odd ones. And one of the things I thought was fun was the baptism ritual. In the baptism ritual, they grab hyssop and they dunk it in water and they just fling it at you, and it's like being drenched. So anybody who's been, I sprinkle you with hyssop, I drown you with hyssop. But one of the things he said was that when you become a convert, you are given two angels. There is your holy guardian angel and your holy guardian demon, and they both sit on one shoulder and the other shoulder. And the holy guardian demon, it didn't say the holy guardian demon is supposed to tempt you. It said you should always try to keep your holy guardian angel happy and not follow the ways of your holy guardian demon. Now, outside of the ritual, outside of that particular thing, it implies that these angels are quite low down on the hierarchy, and certainly not your your higher genius or something like that, which I regard as your divine part, your divine self.
Yes, absolutely. That's the whole thing, and even reading some of the stuff that like Stephen Flowers has done on the Fravashi, the Zoroastrian or Iranian sort of counterpart of the holy guardian angel. To me, it's too exteriorized. And obviously, coming through this Kabbalistic Golden Dawn system, not only that, but being in the grade where like that's what I'm supposed to be doing is, but particularly in the later grades of the Adeptus Minor, is you have to really make this contact, and the varying species to which that is accomplished, they point more towards this, as you're saying, exactly the spiritual aspect or transcendent, I would say bornless aspect of your own spiritual architecture rather than something kind of completely exteriorized.
Yeah. I think the Golden Dawn had a wonderful way of doing it. I mean, it didn't mention Holy Guardian Angel at all. And if it was that important, Mathers was certainly the person who was going to mention it. Also, the way that if you look at the 5-6 ritual, a candidate basically dies on the cross, and that effectively pushes down any lower self to be replaced by a higher self, and it only happens, for a moment of that ritual. But the implications and the impact on that can last years. I mean, I disappeared off the grid for 7 years after I had my 5-6 because the impact of that thing, I just couldn't really. It was very hard it was overwhelming. And I mean, I carried on the path, but I disappeared literally into Bulgaria for 7 years. And it was based on that whole idea that, you just can't carry on the way you're going, and you have to surrender to your higher genius. And I think that's why when you look at something like Helios, this whole principle of surrender to your higher genius is one of the most important factors of theurgy or anything that's like it. And as a spiritual process, there is an element of surrendering to it.
So, obviously, you've done some really significant work there with Helios, and you've done some significant histories of particularly of people in the Golden Dawn. But I'm wondering, you've established your Order of the Aurora Aurea, which I believe is you're primarily in Rome, where you're at, and I know that you put it. I think you wrote that it was established within the Golden Dawn egregore, but you removed it so that it could grow into its own thing. And I'm interested to know how that has evolved and how it has influenced your personal approach to magic in any way that you'd be willing to share.
It's quite tricky because each order, if you look at we were talking earlier about the link, each order has its own contacts. Each temple has its own contacts, its own inner communication system. And very often you have to step away from it and see what happens. This is one of the reasons why people talk about occult secrecy, is because, and they don't generally talk about contacts. I mean, the old days, they used to talk about secret chiefs. And then people got very, very confused and started thinking these were real human beings. And if you read all the papers where they're meeting these so-called secret chiefs, it's clear they are not physical beings. But the same thing applies with groups and orders. So Moa would change in accordance to whichever country it was based in. It would have a central connection because it's all part of one contact. But each country itself, if a temple was formed in each country, would take on the nature of what was around it, and its leaders would develop their own contacts so that they could teach it uniquely in that area. And I think that is where a group's useful. I think where you have these mega orders, it's a mistake. Where you have a temple which has got more than, say, 20 people in it, I think it's a mistake. I think because you get diminishing returns after 12 people. But if you get lots of little groups working uniquely within different setups, they take on an energy and speed and direction of their own. They also have a lot of problems of their own, but they have the advantages of being a group with the advantages of being small. And I think one of the mistakes that happened within the Golden Dawn, perhaps, or less so, because the Golden Dawn was never that big, but with later orders, they were trying to be too big, and that is where they all ended up really, really badly. The biggest orders are now more or less commercial enterprises, and they don't really teach magic much anymore. They talk about spiritual development in very, very nebulous terms, and whereas the smaller groups are still doing it, And I think that is where, when you're looking at groups generally, that's where they've got to move to. And what it takes is people to realize, look, yeah, I don't really want to be the head of a global empire of temples. I just want to go off and do my own thing. And I think there's not enough people willing to do that.
Yeah, I think that is it's, and I feel like that's something that originally within at least the Inner Order of the Golden Dawn for a certain period of time, like you were just sort of, it just kind of happened naturally. A good influence or a good example there would be like Florence Farr's Egyptian Adept and the Sphere Group and stuff like that. But I guess I'm interested to know, right, having done all this significant work in I guess evolving or bringing certain magical techniques in a particular direction that you feel called, and having experienced a lot, right, being very well practiced. What do you consider to be the heart of a magical practice or your particular magical practice?
Ooh, tricky question. I used to think there were answers I'd give at different times. And I would say at the moment it's repetition. Doing something every day, even if you don't feel like it. It's not exactly glamorous, not a glamorous thing to say, but actually, I think the biggest power, because if you do something regularly every day, even if it's small and useless, then when you want to, and you want to do a big ritual or something like that, you've got all that battery built up behind you. If you've studied, the other thing I do is study something every day, read a bit of a book every day, and that will also help. So again, not particularly dramatic, but is where I probably would think now is the one thing that 99% of people can't do. If I tell people, do this every day, do this for 20 minutes every day, they won't be able to do it. And when I started, one of the first groups I was in was Servants of the Light, and they had you doing a meditation session, including the middle pillar, but mostly meditation, half an hour every day. And I did it for 5 years, and you had to keep a diary. And I did it for 5 years, and I was boring as hell. But interesting enough, I still have that diary. And most of the stuff I discovered, I went through it the other day. I flicked through it and I noticed some of the ideas I was having then, and I would have been, 21, are things that I developed later on and developing, or am still developing now. And it was just the mere fact that I was being forced into this every day for the 5 years I was in SOL that I got them. Now, you ask somebody to do that, and I tried that because Moa tried to run a correspondence course that was based, this was about 7 years ago, that was based on a Golden Dawn version. I think it was much, much bigger because I wrote a lot of it. A Golden Dawn version of the SOL course where you do a meditation and there'll be information, and then there'll be more exercises or whatever. And I stopped writing it at lesson 13, which is about, which would have been about the time you're supposed to start doing a meditation to get you into the neophyte grade, because I had it all lined up that was where it was going. Because only 2 people had got that far.
Wow.
And those 2 people joined the order. So there was no point in them doing the correspondence course anymore. And I just think that at the time was a big, it was a big shock to me, because I suddenly realized that was different from, that was in a different generation from where I was at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually, since we had mentioned, well, for me, I'll say one of the hearts of my magical practice is, to lead into the next question, is I was trained in, at the same time I was undergoing Golden Dawn initiation. I was trained in various forms of Eastern energy work, and I received training as an acupuncturist and traditional and classical Chinese medicine, things like this. And there's a strong, you're somebody who's written basically an occult classic on talismans and things like this. And obviously you're releasing something by Pat Zaleski as well, these, of a talismanic nature. In the early Taoist canons, there is this belief in sort of this, I guess what we would call astral etheric sort of projection and into the talisman. So energy cultivation and things like that I kept them separate for a long time, the way you were saying you had been taught to do. And I kind of noticed that they were 2 sides of one coin. So that's been incorporated into, over the past years into my magical practice as well. But I'm interested to know your thoughts on particularly that that kind of thing where you're, especially now with this resurgence in goetic practice and things like that, there's this, or there can be a confusion or disagreement. Is it some form of, like Chris Warnock's a great example of that? Is it an intelligence? Is it some kind of energy, etheric force, or is it the doing of an exterior entity such as a spirit or a demon like that? It's a question that I've kind of grappled with over the past couple of months, really, and attempted some experiments to really, I guess, get more of an intimate understanding of the processes at work. But in your experience, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, the GD has an answer to that, and I think it's pretty good. And it's all of them, all of the above. If you look at the way the GD would charge a talisman, it would initiate it. It would basically take the material object, which looks like the Hermetic symbol, has all the Hermetic symbols and forces that you want on it. It's made out of something that is associated with it. It's an object that is generally associated with a force that you want to summon. You then initiate it. So you purify, consecrate it 4 times, whatever. Now, the purposes of a naught initiation is to purify the astral shell. It then brings in the higher genius, which is, say, the planetary spirit or whatever like that, and then a divine spirit above that as well. So you've got all 4 chucked onto one body, one physical body, and you're uniting them in the ritual. Now, you can do that with an initiation because that's exactly what you're doing to a candidate. But if you're doing that in an ordinary ritual, you want a 4-formed type of initiation where this hierarchy is tied to this physical object, and that physical object is asked to be the body of this astral being, which will do what you want it to do. One of the reasons I think as a side is that why paper talismans don't last so long is because they're not very good bodies, whereas a metal one does. If you have a flimsy physical body, then you won't last as long as something that's a bit stronger. And that's one of the reasons why you've got these associations, why paper talismans are very good, but they don't last very long. And the same thing, just as a general rule, what you're wanting to do is to try and get this 4 level. And if you look at Agrippa, he's got the same 4 levels. And he's saying, invoke these spirits in this order: divine name, archangel, angel, intelligence, whatever. And then you've got the physical body of the talisman. And I think this is, when I do a ritual, it's the same thing. You're looking at trying to get something to do that particular edge. Now, with gods, it's a lot easier because gods come with their own daemons. So you invoke a god, you are almost certainly getting a daemon coming with it. So it's a little bit easier. So say you invoke Zeus, you're not going to see Zeus first, but you will get his daemon, particularly if you're making offerings to it. Offerings tend to be only things that daemons can eat. So a physical object like wine, candles, anything like that will be an object of sacrifice for a daemon. Whereas words, ideas, poetry is something that might be inspired by God.
That's brilliant. I love how available that information was. That answer was great. But yeah, that's kind of interesting too. The bringing in sort of that Agrippan hierarchy. As he says, all inferiors are governed by their superiors, and this idea that you've got to work your way from the bottom up, right? I mean, basically, essentially, it was a Renaissance reconstruction or an attempt at Iamblichian methods of theurgy, which, again, to your point, is experiencing the diamond first. experiencing the astral form of Zeus first. Very, very, very important stuff, I think. I'm glad we're getting a chance to talk about it, and you put it very eloquently. I'm wondering, we're towards the end of our conversation here, but I've got a couple of questions that I'm interested to hear your answers. Is there anything in particular right now that has especially piqued your interest lately in magical and adjacent communities, whether it's practical or whether it's scholarly?
The last couple of years, I've been almost totally obsessed with geomancy.
Really?
Yeah, I have written a book about it, but mostly because there's very little in the modern era which had been written about geomancy, whereas there was hugely important in the Middle Ages and the 16th century particularly. And so I started, there were small communities around, people like Sam Block had been doing some work on it. And I started to do some research, and there's not much really good stuff in English, but after a while, it's sort of, by working on it, I got together a system, and mostly based on Christopher Catlin, who is a 16th century geomancer from France. And I find it works really comfortably with magic. And so it's not, most of the time, the way Rigarde wrote about it, and I think Crowley did too, it's not, you have to go back earlier for it to make any sense. I've found that particular thing quite interesting as a form of divination, almost to the point where I don't think I've done a tarot reading, and I have my own tarot deck. I haven't done a tarot reading for a very long time.
Wow. Yeah, it's certainly, I've seen geomancy and related forms of divination like that. I mean, I'm assuming you're talking about maybe ritual divination, but I've seen
rolling dice, just straight rolling dice, and placing on a shield, and then interpreting the points in relationship to that shield. And it is on one hand quite simple, but very complex. And there are times when you sit there absolutely unable to work out what the hell is going on, and then it turns out that it was right all along. Whereas I don't get that with tarot. Tarot was an easier read for me, but geomancy I've had more luck with, I think. And so I put out a book, Star and Stone, which was, I put it out about a year or so ago, and I've got to go back and revise that too, because there's some things I discovered later when I have more and more experience. When I tend to put out books lately, I mean, because I tend to print them, there's some of my stuff is experimental. So my geomancy stuff was, although it was historically based, was experimental. Mm-hmm. I interested Storm Constantine in Helios, so that was lucky, but I put that out myself first because I didn't think anybody would be interested.
Really? Wow.
Well, it's most, if you get, because I started writing for Llewellyn, if you're writing, there's certain books that are only going to interest people over a certain level.
Right.
They're a very hard sell. The occult market is incredibly small. And
like you were saying earlier, I mean, Helios prescribes, daily ritual work for, I think, the course of like 7 months at least. So it's, I guess probably you're seeing that people have, this lack of discipline that book specifically is requiring of you.
But if they had any sense, I mean, one of the things about it is that you can still, all the components of it can still be lifted out as a system. You can still use the various rituals in their own state. They don't have to be used in that particular sequence, but I just happen to do it that way. But that's where I'm going at the moment. At the moment, I'm trying to get back into writing again, because I haven't been writing for a while, and I think I want to get back into that. And I'm doing a lot of my old titles, like the Shem Angels. I want to redo because the Shem Angels is entirely based on the Golden Dawn system, and it needed. Even when I wrote it, I thought this really should be looking at other methods of ritual, other methods of invocation. The seals need to be, I would do differently, and a few things like that. And I want to work on that again. What I've got there works, and it's fine. I quite like some of the things that I did in it, but there are other things I need to update on it. At the moment, I'm currently working on my occult advice book, which I put out once when I'd just lost my job and we were short of money, and I had to turn around a book very, very fast. So I used a lot of writing that I had and turned around a book very, very fast. And I'm now going back to it because it was a good idea, but I just want to expand and deepen it a lot more. I mean, when I say make a bit of money on, if you've ever look at profits from a book, the most you'll ever expect from a book is going to be about $1,000 or $2,000 over about 2 or 3 years. So we're not talking a lot of money here.
Right. So speaking about that, I have a canned question that I give everybody at the end of the interview. I know that you're very focused on practice, which is fantastic. But for anybody that's listened to this conversation today, and whether we're talking about geomancy or whether we're talking about occult history, one of 3 books that you'd recommend listeners to this podcast to check out to get started, or just in general, and by all means, you can list your own.
Getting started with, you would need Dion Fortune's Mystical Kabbalah. I'm not being particularly good here. You also need the 3 books of Cornelius Agrippa.
Oh yeah.
Third one would be a bit tricky. Temptation is to say something really, really graphic, but I think if you're beginning, you don't need that sort of stuff. What you're looking for is something really simple. I would say The Art of True Healing by Israel Regardie.
Very nice. Yeah, I love that. I love the Mystical Kabbalah too. We're doing I'm doing a book club read through of that actually that starts next week, and just every time I read it, this will probably be my 6th read of. Every time I read it, I learn something.
If you want the sequel to that was Gareth Knight's Kabbalistic Symbolism, where he took that is an interesting piece of in a light tradition, is that Gareth Knight was given access to her writings and records and channelings that she used initially for Mystical Kabbalah, but also she also did one for the paths, which was supposed to follow, but she died before it came before she had a chance to do it or finish it. So a lot of that path material ended up in his book, Complete Guide to Kabbalistic Symbolism. So you can see the 2 together. But yeah, Mystical Kabbalah you need, because it just is a basic Noddy writes how to use the Kabbalah thing. And it's really important, particularly if you're starting within the Western Golden Dawn. The Art of True Healing at least shows you how to use magic in a basic, very simple way, which I think is really useful for a beginner. And if you want to start researching, you need Agrippa, because Agrippa contains most of the stuff. Or Francis Barrett's The Magus. I mean, the 2, Francis Barrett just basically ripped off Agrippa anyway. But it's something that is helpful. Yeah. So those are the 2 things I'd say for a beginner. Advanced people are much difficult. I mean, one thing I'd say to somebody who's a little more advanced, and I'd say this to people who are looking at goetic systems because they think it's cool, I'd say read anything by Jake Stratton Kent, because he, to me, and he will be furious because he's dead now, but he'd be furious if he heard me say this. He was the one who got me thinking demons, gods, Underworld. And the two things suddenly all gelled together. And his book Geosophia, and his Grimoire Valarum are two, I think, really important books that everyone should have. Mine's stained with red ink because he explains, for example, demonic pacts in a way that is sensible. And there are lots of people running around trying to make pacts. I mean, there was a case in England where someone was trying to make a demonic pact with somebody and decided to kill two women because they thought that was what the pact required. And if you read what a pact actually is, it seems so stupid that it isn't. But I think this is the sort of stuff people should be reading.
Yeah, I saw that you posted actually. I think it was a distillation of a conversation you had with him specifically about that, right? The demons and the old gods. I think you posted that on your blog.
Yeah.
That was great. Well, where else can people find you at the moment? On the internet or anything else?
Mostly on Facebook. That's the safest place to spot me. I don't. I can't be contacted through my blog. I write on my blog as much as I can, but there's something to do with some kind of attack that I had after I posted something, meant that I couldn't run the comments section anymore. The ISP wouldn't let me run it, so I can't be contacted there. But Facebook's as good as any, and I'm on several Golden Dawn groups and several groups there. It's not easy. It's easy enough to do a search for me there. I've got several groups, and some there's one for Helios Unbound and a few groups. When I put out a book, I tend to set up a Facebook group for people to discuss it. So if you do a search on any of the titles, they're there.
That's great. Well, Nick Farrell, thank you so much for giving me a little slice of your day. I have tremendously enjoyed this conversation, and I, as well as the listeners, I'm sure, we're eagerly awaiting your next offering. So I appreciate you so much. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me. See ya.